I thought that the asks that the province of Alberta has made to Canada were reasonable. I think in the past decade, Canada has treated Alberta in particular disrespectfully. But it is interesting that the negative feedback that you hear is people start off with the separation issue and basically are starting to call it, Danielle Smith traitorous, and yet do not comment on the last 10 years of how they've been, frankly, unfairly treated in Canada. So it's quite interesting that you can see this polarization bubbling up in Canada.
Let's be fair. Anything Apple says around what they're going to be doing with AI, I still do not believe yet because they completely botched the rollout of AI. All right, John, welcome back to the tank. Oh my God, we are settling into the first week or so of Prime Minister Mark Carney in the hot seat. And that started off with a bang. On May 6th, Mark Carney sat down with U.S. President Donald Trump and completely got, what would you say, rejected the 51st state conversation pretty quickly. How do you think he held up in that conversation?
Well, I thought that was the good part of the conversation because, and I thought he handled it very well. But it was also the only part of the conversation because I didn't add the number of words that Carney had spoken, but if it was over 100 words, I'd be surprised.
It seemed like a pretty mute conversation after that comment, basically entangled the entire conversation. Didn't seem like much was discussed, which is maybe what they just wanted in terms of the public perception. But maybe there was a lot of closed doors conversations that were happening. Have you heard anything, though?
Yeah, I mean, here's my view based on that. Nothing's going to happen, really, right? The U.S. is in no hurry whatsoever. You just saw that the U.K. And the U.S. Are coming to some sort of a deal, but the deal is not a no tariff deal. The deal is going to be around, I think they said, aluminum and cars, and trying to get down to the 10%. When I had mentioned to you, if Trump overplayed his hand, if we were talking about 10% tariffs, I think we would just kind of begrudgingly accept it and say, move on. It's the cost of doing business. But here is, my interesting take. I think Carney did a good job by saying nothing really, which is what you and I had said that if we were advising during the election, shut the hell up because you have no leverage and you're dealing with a crazy guy in the White House. And no matter what you think, you're not going to be able to change the course of what they're trying to do. So you got to focus in on, domestic Canada. What's interesting is a lot of the people that were voting for Carney and chanting, the elbows up sloganeering were like, yeah, it's going to be beating up, grinding him down. Carney did exactly what Pierre was being criticized for by basically saying we got no leverage. And Carney did the right thing, but it's contrary to the impression that was left during the election. So I found that the interesting part of that meeting.
Yeah, it sounded like they kept it very cordial, try to make it constructive, wide-ranging conversations, covering trade and security and things like that. But it didn't seem like, they really were drumming up a lot of the public sentiment that we had seen with Trump and other world leaders, which I think is a good thing. I really do think it's a good thing. And as you mentioned, there are more domestic issues that need to be solved before we end up getting into the blender with Trump and whatever else he's got going on in his head, which is exactly where I want to switch gears for a sec, because I don't know if you watched Alberta Premier Danielle Smith's pretty engaging presentation that she gave, but I watched the whole thing and she was quite well put together in terms of her thoughts and her policies and her frameworks, and how she pushed back on a lot of these demands, scrapping Bill C-69, easing pipeline restrictions. I mean, she demonstrated her thoughtfulness around what she is actually asking for. Obviously, there's a referendum that's going to happen in 2026. and they need a lot of the public support. Obviously, she did talk about the elephant in the room, right? And so what were your thoughts on that kind of presentation she gave and what we're going to see now from the other premiers as well as Carney going into June?
Yeah, I thought that the asks that the province of Alberta has made to Canada were reasonable. I think in the past decade, Canada has treated Alberta in particular disrespectfully. You know, whether the fact that the resources happen to be there is a fact. They have a young demographic. They are paying the transfer payments largely landing in Quebec, and they're asking to be fairly treated. And I don't think that's an unreasonable ask. Now, I don't like the discussions around separation. I don't feel that, again, when you start looking disunited, Canada as a front to the rest of the world, you look unstable. I didn't like that part, but and maybe that's the only way to get people to listen. But it is interesting that the negative feedback that you hear is people start off with the separation issue and basically are starting to call it, Danielle Smith traitorous, and yet do not comment on the last 10 years of how they've been, frankly, unfairly treated in Canada. So it's quite interesting that you can see this polarization bubbling up in Canada.
John, something that people don't obviously want to admit, but the fact that we're having these conversations is very similar to the fact that people who were against the tariff talk don't want to admit that we're at least having the conversations about tariffs and the inefficiencies of what the US has been putting up with for the last 30 years, right? Like if this was still a democratic government in the US, we would not be having these conversations. Right. And so the fact that we're having these conversations is a positive sign. Yes, maybe the process could have been done better. Maybe the messaging could have been done better. But hey, this is what happened when things change. And I think the fact that we're having these conversations now in Canada about equalization payments and potential separation is important, right? Like there was a lot of commentary after our last talk around how, Ontario is the big one here who should be having the conversations. No, Alberta and Quebec are equal contributors to GDP, around 450 billion each. Obviously, Ontario is number one at 900 billion. But Quebec gets 13.2 billion in equalization payments due to its population size. But Quebec's significant hydroelectric revenue from Hydro-Quebec is basically shielded in the equalization formula.
Gets excluded in the formula.
It gets excluded. And unlike non-renewables, like Alberta's oil, which is included at 50% of its fiscal capacity calculations, hydro revenues are not fully counted. And these are considered renewable. So this lowers Quebec's calculated fiscal capacity, increasing its equalization entitlements. And Quebec's lower electricity rates suppress the potential revenue, which is incredibly unfair to Albertans. I mean, the other part that I think is kind of crazy is, remember Mark Carney, he was there for Brexit.
Right.
Is he here for Albertexit? Is that what they're going to call it? Another referendum?
I hope we don't go. We don't get to that point.
Well, of course, my point. I am just saying, what are the coincidences that Carney's in part of both Commonwealth, referendums in this conversation? But I think the fact that we're having these conversations is important. Yeah, because people have been putting up for too long.
Yeah, and the big difference is Alberta's complaints, in my view, are quite legitimate. On the Brexit, it was populist misinformation, frankly, that I was stunned that Britain had the greatest deal with the EU. It was a masterful, and they undid that, which I think that was kind of crazy. So that's the big difference on here. And I agree with you. What is also interesting is, Carney grew up in Edmonton, and, it's a very interesting dynamic.
Yeah. Speaking of interesting dynamics, John, we've got this big news on OpenAI. So they're not going forward on the for-profit structure. They're staying as a nonprofit. but they still do have this huge partnership with Microsoft that they now need to basically renegotiate.
Yeah.
And I can't believe we're already at this point in this, life expectancy between these two organizations, because it was only a few years ago that this deal was struck, right? So for those who have been living under a rock, the existing deal that OpenAI agreed to was to share 20% of its revenue with Microsoft through 2030, a year in which OpenAI had projected it would generate 174 billion in revenue, according to the information. And though in recent weeks, OpenAI told some potential and current investors that by 2030, it would only share 10% of revenues with partnerships like Microsoft. So there's all these conversations now happening quite sooner than maybe people expected. The payouts are pretty significant for Microsoft. The investment they made, I can't believe the return they potentially could get on this by 2030. Have you seen the numbers, John?
No, I haven't.
It's like a $200 billion return for the investment that they made, which was obviously in the form of like Azure cloud credits, right? And so basically they're renting servers from Azure yearly for like $1 billion. They're giving 20% of their profits up to 92 billion back to Microsoft. And Microsoft basically signed the best deal of its lifetime. I mean, they have all the leverage because they can't do anything without Microsoft, including converting to a for-profit. So it just shows you, like, as much as these foundation model companies are soaring in terms of adoption and usage, there still is the underlying infrastructure, control that these people, because they don't control their own infrastructure, are subjected to these sort of leverage conversations.
It also speaks to the unit economics ultimately, right?
Right.
You have, these partnership agreements, you have the infrastructure usage, you still have all the copyright issues that still has been unresolved. So there's still so much noise there. But I wonder, specific to OpenAI, the honeymoon with Sam Altman is, been grinding a number of people. And I don't know if you saw the news that the former CEO of Instacart has now become the most senior executive at OpenAI, reporting directly to Sam Altman. And I think the title is the CEO of applications, but I wonder if it's designed because she is a very well connected and, as I understand it, diplomatic person, and whether they're trying to cool the temperatures with various partners. So it's a very interesting development.
The thing that obviously you and I talked about is, like, when will the foundation model builders get into the application world? And we always knew it was coming, but now it's coming fast and furious. So you got OpenAI agreeing to buy Windsurf for about $3 billion, which is the competitor to like Cursor, this code writing platform. But then you also have Amazon, announcing their own code writing initiatives as well, taking aim at Cursor with its new AI coding service. So you've got these large, incumbents who have a lot of control, building out their own applications. Some of them obviously are going to be faster adopted than others, given how big sort of Amazon is. But then you've got Cursor raising money. They just closed a $900 million funding round led by Thrive Capital, with a bunch of other players chipping in as well. The company is soaring, reaching 200 million ARR very quickly, at a $9 billion valuation. But then you've got Amazon also creating its own, this entangled web of like all these venture funds betting on all these different players. You've got the incumbents either competing or investing in a lot of these larger application tools. And then you've got the funniest story of all, I think, in the last week, is Apple sucker punching Google right in the face. When that partnership had been going on forever, John.
Yes.
What are your thoughts on that one?
Well,
it's like a soap opera.
Yeah, that is. And did you see, not only is that fight happening, did you see that Mozilla was having a fight as well too, because the Firefox browser was based on a deal as well too. And with the DOJ coming in and going, hey, you know what, folks, like it's interesting. During the Democrat government, everyone thought that they were going to go after these large tech and start breaking them up. Trump comes in, they go, whew, he's not going to do that. Yet do you see what's happening right now?
The
And
DOJ wants to bar Google from paying to be the default search engine for third-party browsers, including Firefox, right? That's
right,
the news.
right,
So
and
it's going to be forced to sell Chrome, which we talked about the other week, which
right,
OpenAI put their hand up to say they would buy.
and
But
now Google's being forced to sell AdX, and
yeah,
so it's fascinating to see all and the deal of Google and Apple was the one that it is so massive to Google. If it's no longer the default browser, and by the way, Apple made a ton of money off of that exclusivity as well. So it's fascinating to see these starting to be rocked.
I also think, let's be fair. Anything Apple says around what they're going to be doing with AI, I still do not believe yet because they completely botched the rollout of AI and it's still very shitty of an
Still waiting
experience.
for it. Still waiting for that.
We're still waiting for it. So like the fact that, Google sold off 7-8%, on Wednesday, May 7th. I still don't believe that's probably right for where Google is still ahead on a lot of other fronts, but you're right. It's $20 billion per year.
Yeah, I mean,
It's a lot of cash.
Yeah. Now the Google sell-off, as I understood it, was associated with the comments made by one of the executives.
Search
That
is
said,
down.
search is down. Now, what's interesting about that comment was, I was chatting with my 19-year-old son, and I had said to him, we were looking at something. I said, like, just Google it, and he just said, like,
We don't do that anymore, Dad.
I don't do that. I do Chat GPT is what he uses. And it was fascinating to see, and I could see all, the history on there. And he's using Chat GPT the exact same way that I use Google.
Yeah.
And so that's fascinating to see that. And then when I saw the statement that their search was down was it the first time ever search was down?
The first time in a while.
Yeah. Now, I thought they were saying that to get the DOJ off of their backs because of the whole situation
Monopoly,
of the monopoly. But maybe those were just coincidental. But if Google's search is truly under attack, what does that mean for Google?
That does. I mean, speaking of your son, actually, that was my next topic I wanted to see. Did you see this viral piece that was going in New York Magazine, basically laying bare to the basically bleak landscape in higher education, where students are spending their free time on TikTok and using ChatGPT and similar tools to handle their coursework, right? So
Yes.
basically, it's everyone is cheating in college is the headline. And many people are basically calling for the return to in-class essay writing.
Yep. Well, let me ask you
cursive, maybe.
Yeah. And I read that article and they said cheating. Well, now I'm going to disclose a little bit of my age on here, but there was a time where you couldn't bring a calculator into math class.
Agreed.
Right. And, and we got over that. Is this the same equivalency? Because we had the same issue. You were barred and that was viewed as cheating.
I think the whole idea of school in its essence has to be rethought. In the way of which we teach in general. So the essay process, yes, maybe is important to learn, and creative thought and writing it, on the fly is important. But I don't think that's where we want to just stop teaching, like at that structure. I think we have to recalibrate entire way of which people are being taught to learn different skills. And so maybe this article is just laying bare to the fact that the way we've been teaching kids is not the way they're currently learning.
Right.
And there's new ways to do it, and we just need to adapt to it. But yes, there is going to be a time where people are taking advantage of the new way to do things with the old rules.
Right.
And we need to change the rules, right?
Yeah. And, maybe, and teaching, when I was in school was all based on memory, right? And whoever had the greatest capacity to remember,
because you read the book 5 minutes before walking in the door to the auditorium to write the exam.
I used to take the Cole's Notes version, so I think I got away from reading any book ever in high school. But that's a different story.
For the last article I want to talk about, John, I don't know if you saw this in the Wall Street Journal, but the new fund that Coatue is raising, being anchored by family offices of Amazon, Jeff Bezos, and Michael Dell, is now accepting investors with as small as $50,000.
50,000.
$50,000, expanding the pool of investors, putting capital into higher growth startups. This is gaining a lot of discussion.
Yeah.
Obviously, there's a bunch of technicalities in terms of how you can get people into these funds. But what are your thoughts on this? I mean, just such a brand name fund like Coatue opening up this private public access to smaller investors.
Yeah, I mean, but this trend's been going on for the last number of years, right? So the very large funds started to say, they're getting tapped out on raising bigger and bigger funds by going to institutions, and there's a whole process of doing that. And they started to tap in to the they call it the RIA network, say in the United States, right? It's folks that have RSP money equivalent, and a number of the U.S. players changed their designation so that they could become more of a financial services company. And I forget what the regulatory change is, but that was Andreessen, Sequoia. You had the large traditional private equity firms doing this. So I think that this is a continuation of the trend as if you can grab dollars en masse using efficient means and getting smaller checks, frankly, it benefits the funds that are asset gatherers, not investors. And what happens too is if you have tens of thousands of small investors, you really don't report to anybody. And I don't know if you noticed there too, they've provided a liquidity mechanism. So it's almost akin to investing in a mutual fund, but it's still a private fund. So it is interesting. What I do worry, and we've talked about this trend before, is the polarization or the barbell approach to investment. It's either these massive Walmarts of investing, and there's a number of those that have broken out in the United States, and then there are these very niche boutiques of very highly specialized, and I'd call them true investors and not asset gatherers. And the problem is getting caught in the middle between those two. So I think this is the continuing trend.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think there's going to be, like you said, stock pickers and the index model, the Vanguards and the Buffetts. Right. And it's happening across all investment classes. So until next time, thanks for joining us in the tank today, John, as always.
Great. Thanks, Matt.